This is getting weird. I'm live, so everybody be quiet so the cops don't get caught.
Across the street.
Across the street again? Oh, nice. Okay. They make regular visits over there, unfortunately. Well, welcome everybody on internet land. Welcome the few people here. We're continuing in Acts, our study in Acts. We should finish chapter 19 today. We're going from 28. Can you hear all right? You're good? Okay. Everybody good?
Yeah.
Screaming and hollering. All right. All two of you? Okay. 28 all the way to the end of the chapter. And verse 40, just kind of piecing it together. And even if we're not the full hour, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and stop there because chapter 20 is going to be a switch. It will mark Paul wanting to go back to Jerusalem, and that will be where his ministry basically changes. And I like the Buc-ee's cup, but that ministry will change from planting churches and missionary work to shipwrecks and captivity, and eventually his trials and his death. And so we're on the downhill slope of Acts, but also in 20, I don't want to get started on it tonight because there's so much meat right here going into the final of Paul's life that it's going to take us some time. So
What are we on?
chapter 19 now, 28 to the end of the chapter and 40. Last week, if you remember, Paul was in Ephesus. He'd been in Ephesus for quite some time, almost 3 years, and he had many people come to Christ. They baptized. They brought a lot of people into Christ. In fact, Ephesus would be one of the strongest churches to come out of the first century and would last, I think, up to 600 years. And before it would finally, town of Ephesus and everything would just kind of go its own way. But it would also be the place where John, as we do Sundays, in our Sunday services, it's where John wrote his letter, his gospel. John the Apostle, not John the Baptist, wrote the Gospel of John in Ephesus. And so it would become a very, very important place in first century Christianity and even today. And it would also become one of the churches that is mentioned in the 7 letters in Revelations. Now, what happened last week was because Paul was so successful, because the gospel was so successful, I shouldn't say Paul, but I should say the gospel was spreading and people were accepting the gospel so well that it made a few folks upset. And this would have been the ones who, this gentleman named Demetrius, especially a silversmith, who it says in verse 24, made silver shrines to the god Artemis. And so basically he runs a souvenir shop outside of the temple of Artemis, which is one of the 7 wonders of the world, which is a real big deal. And so Artemis is upset because his pocketbook's getting smaller. And so he begins to cause an uproar against Paul and other Christians and his followers. And that's where we're kind of at right now, is the beginning of this social unrest, to put a good word on it. And so we'll start in 28, we'll read down to the bottom, and then we'll back up and take it in pieces. So does anybody like to read from 28 to 40? Anybody winded tonight?
I probably could.
Okay, loud and proud.
When they heard this and were filled with rage, they began crying out, saying, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians."
Oh, where you at? We'll start at 28.
Right.
Oh, yeah, you are. They say that again in 34. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay.
My bad.
The city was filled with confusion, and they rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. And when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. Also, some of the Asiarchs who were friends of his sent to him and repeatedly urged him not to venture into the theater. So then, some were shouting one thing and some another. For the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they had come together. Some of the crowd concluded it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward, and having motioned with his hand, Alexander was intending to make a defense to the assembly. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, a single outcry arose from them all as they shouted for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." After quieting the crowd, and the town clerk said, "Men of the Ephesus, what man is there, after all, who does not know that the city of Ephesians is guardian of the temple of the great Artemis, and of the image which fell down from heaven? So since these undeniable facts, you ought to keep calm and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our goddess. So then, if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against any man, the courts are in session and proconsuls are available. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in the lawful assembly. For indeed we are in danger of being accused of a riot in connection with today's events, since there is no real cause for it, and in this connection we will be unable to account for this disorderly gathering." After saying this, he dismissed the assembly.
Okay. Thank you. So this isn't new, is it? This happens a lot to Paul and Peter and John and the disciples as they move and they plant churches in these areas. And this is just another example. This time it's not the Jews doing it, it's the people that live in Ephesus, the Greeks, the Artemis cult, so to speak. And so in 28 and 29, it says that in 29, so the city was filled with confusion. And they'll use that again. Nobody knows why, right? They're just kind of, dude's stirring up trouble. He's making claims about Paul and his disciples. He's been there for several years. And they're just stirring up trouble. And people are following this deal and they don't really know why. Me. Never miss a good opportunity to have a riot, right? Yep. Human nature. So this has gone on. If you remember too, Good Friday, remember, or not Good Friday, Palm Sunday, when Christ came into Jerusalem right before Passover, his last week, and everybody that was there were praising him. They were laying palms in front of him, and they were praising Christ as he came in. And the Pharisees said, you really got to keep your people quiet. They're causing an uproar. And Christ said that if they were quiet, even the rocks would cry out in worship. Okay, so, but those same people a week later would be the ones who were throwing rocks at him. They were the ones who were calling out to him, who were mocking him, who were spitting on him, who were hitting on him as he walked down the Via Dolorosa to Calvary. So it's a picture of human nature. We don't need anything, really a reason, do we? We just need a crowd. And we'll discuss this a little later on because it uses confusion a few times in this line of scripture talking about the people. Hey, man, they're having a party, so we're going to go that way. In 30 and 31, Paul again, obviously they had taken Gaius and Aristarchus in verse 29. They've dragged them into the amphitheater, which I understand was quite large. and would possibly hold 24,000 people. So this is a big old amphitheater. This is like, this is bigger than the Civic Center in Amarillo. I mean, this thing's huge, right? It's like a professional arena. And so this is where everybody's going. And they take Gaius and Aristarchus. These are traveling partners of Paul's. They came from Macedonia. They're his disciples. They're close to him. In fact, he'll mention them in letters. And of course, Paul, being Paul, wants to go in there as well, right? He wants to be a part of that. He doesn't want to let his guys get hung, kind of left in there on their own. But the other disciples kind of pull Paul off to the side, and even some of what my version says, provincial officials of Asia say, you don't want to be here. You need to go. If he goes in there, he's probably going to get smoked. So you need to go somewhere else and just let all this take place. And so, but this kind of takes us back to Acts in 18, 9, and 10. Paul was in Corinth, remember? If you look back, just flip the page. And the Lord said to Paul in a night vision in verse 9, don't be afraid, but keep on speaking and don't be silent, for I am with you, and no one will lay a hand on you to hurt you, because I have many people in the city. He made a promise to Paul, at least in Corinth, that he wouldn't be hurt. He had a duty. He had a mission. He had, obviously, in Corinth, Christ had a vision for Paul that Paul wouldn't know of at the time. But here we are, we're spending 3 years in Ephesus, and it was not time for Paul to get beat up. And so basically he tells him, I'm going to take care of you. And we see this happen in Acts 19 at this point, where the people are taking him away. And also, if you remember, in verse 17, Jason, y'all remember Jason? Where the Jews come to Jason's house in Thessalonica, and they're looking for Paul, and Paul. There's too many P's. They come looking for Jason in chapter 17, verse 5, where they come looking for Paul. They don't find him. And so they take Jason, another disciple of Paul's, and wind up dragging him out and beating him instead, right? So here's another example of God saving Paul for a purpose, for what he needed Paul to do, even against Paul's wishes. It sounds like, if you're kind of looking at this from an outside point of view, it kind of makes you think Paul's sort of chicken, that he's going to let his buddies take the beating. But it's really not that way at all. It's God using his hand, because Paul would have more of an influence than Jason would. And it sounds bad, but it's just kind of how it went. And so he's doing that here too, in Ephesus. Okay, as we enter into 32, it says, meanwhile, some were shouting one thing and some another, because the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Again, sheep, meh, monkey see, monkey do. Let's all have a party, right? We have no idea why we're there. All we know is that people are upset, people are mad, and so we're just going to go with our brother Ephesians to the amphitheater and make ourselves known. Which they were, but it didn't make any sense because they didn't know why they were there. It said some were saying this, some were saying that, up with people, down with people, up with Artemis, this is a lesson pretty much for all of us. God does not work in confusion, does he? God is a God of order. And so what we have here is a heathen society. It is a selfish society, as we've seen, which this riot started with, this upheaval has started with, because Demetrius was more worried about his pocketbook than he was anything else, even Artemis. And so we see the focus where the Ephesians are on this, and we see that they are living in confusion. They are there just to stir up trouble. We could also pick out several parts throughout history, even in the history of the United States, where riots have started, possibly for a few people for a reason, but after that reason kind of gets started, then people just jump in just because it's an advantage to them. They can loot, they can get stuff for free, they can just let go, right? Rebellion, that is of the devil, that is of a fallen world. And they are very, very, they are projecting this right now, the Ephesians are. And so, as Christians, as we look at the way they're reacting, that's not a way that we should react. Okay? In our life, in any matter that's going on, if we have the Spirit within us, and I'll mention this over and over again, Galatians 5:22 and 23, it's the fruit of the Spirit. If we have the Spirit in us, this is what we will be like. This is what we will act, because it's the Spirit working out of us. Is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. So keep that in mind. Even modern day, this plays out modern day. We'll get into that more as we move on. We have a long stretch of scripture to get there. And so moving down into 33 to 34, is everybody keeping up pretty good right now? Any questions? No? Okay. 33 and 34, we have this gentleman, Alexander. We don't know much about him. We just know his name's Alexander. Obviously, he is a Jew, but he's a Hellenistic Jew. How do you think we know he's a Hellenistic Jew?
Well, my Bible says the Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander forward
Right,
and told him to explain the situation.
right. But how do we know that Alexander's Hellenistic? Just this little side note for future reference. Alexander is not a Jewish name.
Yeah.
It's a Greek name, right? Okay. So here we have this Hellenistic Jew, which there were many in Ephesus. And this guy's named Alexander, and his buddies push him out into the front of this crowd. Now, he must have had some influence. They must have known who he was. There must have been something about Alexander that was special, or he was known in the community amongst the people that were causing the disturbance, and as well as his cronies behind him. Because they obviously thought he might have some kind of say or clout of some sort. But as he goes to raise his hand and give his apology, or his apologia, is saying we're not part of this deal, what do the Greeks say? In 34, halfway through 34.
They started shouting about how great Artemis is.
All right, Artemis of the Ephesians, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. You see, they knew he was a Jew, though not very well liked. The Jewish people were throughout the Roman Empire. The thing of it is, they didn't separate the Greeks, the Gentiles did not separate Paul and the disciples, Peter, John, Barnabas. They were not separate from the Jews that they knew. They just saw them as another Jewish sect. Remember, we talked about there were different Jewish sects. Obviously, we have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and there were several others involved in their smaller sect. And so they just saw Christianity, or the way as it was referred to this time, as just another sect from the Israelite people. And so as they thought this Alexander was coming to defend Paul, possibly, or defend the way and the other disciples, they overshout him, right? That's a good way to win an argument, isn't it? Just shout them down. You don't even have to say anything. You just get them to shut up by shouting real loud. there's a park in London. I wish I could remember. One of y'all might remember the name of the park. I can't think of it, but they have a box out there. They have a stage, so to speak, where you go and you have a public debates. They've been doing this forever, and it's become real popular. It's up by Oxford, I believe, and it's become real popular because Oxford's, great, one of the major apologist school in the world, and so the Muslims and the Christians, they come and they debate back and forth in groups of people. And so as the Muslims give their debate, their apology, that it's kind of funny because usually the Christians are somewhat quiet and reserved down at the bottom, but when the Christians get up to give their apology, it gets very loud. And so you can't hardly talk over the crowd because the crowd becomes so loud. And so this is just kind of what they're doing. This is a famous tactic. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any understanding. It's just, we don't want to hear you. We're going to just shut you up. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. Solomon said, nothing new under the sun. We still have those same tactics today, don't we? We've seen them in rallies across the country over the last several years. We've seen groups come up. What is it, Antifa or whatever? One of those weird kind of deals. I don't even know what you call those guys. But that's always, they overshout reason. Again, here's a good example of a broken world, a fallen world, a sinful world. Is that when there's reason, nobody listens to it. They just hide it. They try to overshout it and be louder than the reason, because reason what? Reason affects pride. Reason hurts pride. And so that's what they're doing to this poor guy, Alexander, that just gets pushed in front of the crowd. They didn't do anything else to him as far as I know, which is probably a good thing.
Some of the translations use Diana instead of Artemis. Same thing.
Yeah, it's one's Roman and one's Greek. Diana was the Roman version of Artemis. You see, when the Romans came up, they were kind of Greek, right? They came from Alexander and the 5 generals as everything got split after Alexander the Great died. And so the 2 Roman generals, I believe, that they just adopted everything, but they made it, everything that the Greeks had, they made theirs basically with a little bit of extra added to it. So they just changed from Latin Artemis to Latin Diana. So they did that with just about everybody. Apollo, Mars. Yep. So 35. Remember, we're sitting in this is the hub, like you said, of Diana, of Artemis. This is the hub. This is her spot. This is like the Mecca for Greek mythology. And so a city clerk comes, luckily, which a city clerk at the time would have held much sway amongst the people. And he calls down to him. He says, "Men of Ephesus." He gets their attention and he calmed them down, which is probably a good thing. But he mentions this thing in 35. Who doesn't know the city of Ephesians is the temple guardian of the great Artemis and of the image that fell from heaven? Okay, we don't specifically know what this image was. It was a carved image of some sort. But that kind of shows you the mentality, because we've been here. This temple has been here for over 1,000 years. They have been worshiping her for forever, right? And as far as we know, there was a story that passed down. There's this one image of her, this statue that was made, that was created by some guy, and from what we understand, possibly was rebuilt over 7 different times. But the story was that this image that this guy made, I guess, to sell souvenirs or do something, I don't know. He claimed it fell from heaven. Could have been somebody could have seen a meteor, and then he claimed that this is what happened. You know, they said the same thing about the shield of Mars. It was popular in Greek mythology that these accoutrements, these things that the gods send them down from heaven, right? And so that's kind of what he's saying. This is part of there, but they're so far beyond. Think about it. They're about 2,000 years. 2,000 years from this image first being created. And so they have this story that's been distorted that everybody believes over these 2,000 years, right? They don't know how this thing got there, it just got there. And so you have this story at the end of it. The difference is, one of the cool things is we're 2,000 years from Christ. We do have an image that came from heaven that we do worship, that we know where he came from. We know what he did. It's historically proven that he was here. It's historically proven that he died. It's historically proven that he was raised from the dead. And we still have the same story at 2,000 years as we did then when he came. But in this Gentile, this heathen mythology belief, horribly distorted over 2,000 years. So you can see the influence, God's influence on what we're doing here, right? Just kind of an interesting little fact. I don't know if it has anything to do with what we're talking about, but there you go. So that's the image that everybody's upset about too, you know. But this clerk continues to give his speech, and he says, therefore, what's the therefore? Because, you know, talking about this image, and since these things are undeniable. So he's claiming that this image is undeniable now.
But they don't know what it is.
But they don't know what it is. They know it's an image. It came from heaven. It kind of looks like Diane, but it's undeniable, right? That's what he claims. So at least he has some faith. Remember, Demetrius didn't. He was more worried about his pocketbook, and he just used the temple to stir everybody up. But at least this guy's got some reason. Not real sure about the undeniable part, but he tells them you must keep calm and not to do anything rash. Don't do anything stupid or crazy. Because what happens when the Romans hear about something rash going on?
Put it down.
It doesn't last very long, does it? They nip it in the bud and they take out every source of that problem and they totally do away with it. And so they are, number one, they're Greeks, which the Romans didn't care much for, even though they kind of come from that. There's a lot of foreigners in Ephesus. And so Rome, at this time, there was, I can't remember if they're still in the Pax Romana or not, the Roman peace. But even though that Rome is called the Pax Romana because Rome wasn't in a war with anybody else. They'd pretty much almost conquered the entire known world at the time. And so there weren't any wars, but the way that they kept that peace was if any little thing happened, poof, they just went on top of it and they crushed it. And it wasn't good for the person that started the trouble. And so this temple, this image that they're so worried about, if they do a riot, it's a very good opportunity for the Romans to come in here and totally take their temple away from it, knock it down, take their religion away, and pretty much put them under their thumb pretty hard. And we know this because they did it in 70 AD to 74 AD. They did it to the Jews in the Masada. And they spent 4 years building a 200-foot siege ramp up on the top of the Masada. Look it up on the internet. It's pretty cool. Still there. But they totally did away. They laid siege to Jerusalem. They starved them out. They died of disease. They totally obliterated the temple. So they don't put up with a whole lot of junk. They'll take away every source. of the trouble.
Masada happened just a short time after the destruction of the temple. Didn't it?
Yeah, because they set out the walls for forever. That's what Rome would sit there and they would sit, and they kind of learned this from the Greeks, but they would sit out of the city and they would block it in, and they wouldn't let anything in and out. I mean, they totally closed the city off, so they would eventually run out of food. They would eventually run out of just about everything. They get sick. They would die. They would become filthy. A good example, and the thing it happened to Rome. That's one of the interesting parts of it. That's how Rome fell, because of a foreign general that was in the Roman army that was a Goth. He knew the Roman tactics and was able to influence his own people and his cousins, the Vandals and the Visigoths, to seize the entire city of Rome, where they couldn't get in or out, and forced them to starve, forced them into filthiness, disease, and cannibalism, and that's how Rome, the city of Rome, fell, and that's what destroyed the Western Empire of Rome. So yeah, be careful what you teach people. Sometimes it comes back to bite you. But that's just on the side there. That's an interesting little fact to know.
But there's some evidence that the people in Masada, some of them actually committed suicide to get away from prevailing.
Yeah, there's a historian named Josephus that was the only person to live. Now, they don't know, they found him in a hole with a whole lot of dead people. And so they don't know if he just wasn't gutsy enough to kill himself or just hadn't got to that point yet. But when the Romans found him, he was in a hole with several other people who had committed suicide and killed their children as well, so the Romans wouldn't get a hold of them. Romans were great people, just really cheerful. Those are the ones you want knocking on your door, huh? Yeah, so Josephus, they took Josephus and actually turned him into a historian, and he wrote the history of the Jewish people, the Israelite people, in a very big book. Flavius Josephus. I suggest you get it, but use it as a reference because you'll be reading it forever. It's big. It's interesting, but it's big. And so we move on in 37. The clerk is trying to reason with them, not to do anything rash or doing anything stupid. So he says in 37, "For you have brought these men here who are not temple robbers or blasphemers of our goddess. So if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a case against anyone, the courts are in session, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another." So here we have Paul, Gaius, Aristarchus, the disciples, basically the influence of the way in Ephesus, falsely accused again. This has been a common problem from the very beginning. It starts with Acts in chapter 6, 11 through 15, if you want to turn back there real quick. We're going to be in Acts the whole time, so just kind of backtrack and see what they have had to put up with.
11 through 15.
Yeah, Acts chapter 6, 11 to 15. Would anybody like to read that loud and proud?
So they persuaded some men to lie about Stephen, saying, "We heard him blaspheme Moses and even God." This roused the people, the elders and the teachers of religious law. So they arrested Stephen and brought him before the high council. The lying witnesses said, "This man is always speaking against the holy temple and against the law of Moses." We heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy the temple and change the customs Moses handed down to us. At this point, everyone in the high council stared at Stephen because his face became as bright as an angel's.
So Stephen was kind of falsely accused too, wasn't he? I mean, they were right, but they were only half right. Christ did say that in 3 days tear this building down, and in 3 days I will build it back up. Speaking of his body being the temple, changing the customs that Moses handed down to us, yes, he did, but the customs that Moses had actually pointed to Christ and the fulfillment of the law. So in their physical understanding, they didn't quite understand, but they were blaming, and Stephen, they were falsely accusing him, basically blaspheme, but they were stirring up other people at the same time, right? It's easier to accuse someone falsely if you got backup, right? Hyenas run in herds, right?
Yeah.
And so again, Acts 12, at the very beginning, we have the good King Herod. Herod, that was a great dynasty. That was a high spot of the Israelite people. About that time, this is in Acts chapter 12, about that time King Herod cruelly attacked some who belonged to the church, and he killed James, John's brother, with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter too, and during the days of unleavened bread. So King Herod doing the good thing that King Herod does, found James, cut his head off, and was so popular for it that he went after Peter and several others. For what? Same thing, blasphemy. Chapter 13, 50, verse 50. God, 13 was a long chapter, wasn't it? Again, this is in Antioch, and this is Paul and Barnabas, and they're getting stirred up again. And it says in 50, but the Jews incited the religious women of high standing and the leading men of the city. They stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas and expelled them from their district. So here we go again. Stirring them up, causing trouble, getting important people to get their cause really for no reason. And then just because it hurts their pride, basically. Then chapter 16, 19 to 24. This was with the, if y'all remember, this was Paul and Silas going to prison in, bear with me, was it in Philippi? Where the girl, the fortune tellers, had this girl, and she was bothering them, and they basically rebuked her and got the devil out of her. And her two owners of the slave girl got upset in 19 and 24. They kind of did the same thing again, because like Demetrius, their pocketbook was hurt. This girl who was telling fortunes was not making them any money anymore. So when her owners saw that the hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities. And in bringing them before the chief magistrates, they said, these men are seriously disturbing our city. They are Jews and are promoting customs that are not legal for us as Romans to adopt or practice. Then they beat them with rods. So there we go. Then 17:5, Jason's house again. And we've already covered that, so we'll skip that one. And chapter 18, verse 13. Here we go again. 12. While Gallio was proconsul in Achaia, the Jews made a united attack against Paul and brought him to the judge's bench. 13, this man, they say, persuades the people to worship God contrary to the law. And so there we go. Falsely accused over and over and over again out of pride and out of arrogance. Just because their pocketbooks were hurt or their pride was hurt or their beliefs were hurt somehow. And that hasn't changed. As I mentioned Sunday in my sermon, millions of martyrs can attest to that. And over 100,000 every year can attest to that. Whether it be reformers, whether it be Catholics who have died early on in the faith, whether it be Christians in Middle Eastern countries, whether it be Christians in Mexico, Christians in communist countries. China, they still get drugged out and put in prison and falsely accused as pastors. So this continues today. This is an attack on Christianity. It always has been. It's nothing common. It's just as we see as it happened to Paul and Peter and John and Gaius and Aristarchus and Jason and everybody else. It's common and it's going to happen. Christ said, they hate me because of my name, and they'll hate you because of my name as well. And they do. Because Christianity, the gospel, is light, it is life, and the world is dark. And the light always expels the dark. And so this will always be a source of conflict. It's not a warning. It's not a don't go and be Christian because you're going to get abused. It's you're going to get abused for the name of Christ. You're going to get abused for the name of eternal salvation for Christ and for other disciples. And don't be surprised. Don't be surprised, because it's going to happen to you. You will have trouble. There will be difficulties in life, especially as a Christian. But again, as we look back in Galatians, we have the Spirit in us as Christians. We have love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, so we're able to handle it. And most importantly, we got Christ at our back, so we can handle it all the more, because we know as Christians, this is not the place. We're just visitors here. We're just passing through. This is a burp in the long line of time, our life. And so what's important is what comes afterwards. And that's why the martyrs have done what they've done. That's why Paul told Timothy and told the Philippians, I'm being poured out as a drink offering. He took these things, the things that happened to him, the beatings, the imprisonments, the sicknesses, everything we're fixing to see come to fruition within the next 8 chapters from 20 to the end of the book of Acts. The shipwrecks, everything we see happen to him, he gladly took, even though he would suffer for them physically. He gladly took because he understood what was on the other side of this deal. And he understood the influence it would have in the world then. And maybe he didn't even understand the influence it has on us now, 2,000 years later. That's pretty cool. And so as we move on to the end, basically he says, the clerk of the city basically says, if you have anything wrong, take it before your lawyer, prove it. And usually when you stand up to a bully and you say, prove it, what do? They back up. They start catfishing or crawfishing, right? They start sliding backwards. And also he reminds them in verse 40, in fact, we run a risk of being charged with rioting for what happened today. If anybody hears what you've already done, we can get charged with rioting today. Basically, is what he's telling them. Since there's no justification that we can give a reason for this disorderly gathering. Even God puts wise people amongst goobers every once in a while. What's that? Thank you. So again, he reminds them that we're under Rome now, and if we can get charged, even with what's gone on, because there's no justification for it, even what's gone on, if the consul or the pre-consul or the governor of the Roman governor of this territory gets word, then it's done for all of us, and possibly even the Roman governor.
The governor, yeah.
Yeah, he would lose his life.
Allow
Remember,
it to happen.
right? Because if you remember Pontius Pilate, that was one when he's trying to judge Christ and he's figuring out what to do with the Jews and what to do with Christ. That's one of his main worries, because if he doesn't do anything to Christ and the Jews rebel and they cause a problem, he may squash it, but he's lost a job. In the very least, he's lost the job. Probably going to go to a Roman prison, which really wasn't all that fun. More than likely would lose his life. So, yeah, that would give anybody in Ephesus something to think about. So that will finish. He dismissed the assembly. They all went home. We lived happily ever after. And next week again, as we move into 20, this is going to be the final for Paul. This is our last 8 chapters. This is going to be, his missions are done. He's planted churches. He's got Titus. He's got Priscilla and I always get this wrong. Priscilla and Aquila. I always get this wrong. But he has them, and they'll return to Rome with him. Well, at the point he's in Rome. But we'll also come up with somebody new, somebody who's actually written the book of Acts and wrote a gospel, and that's Luke. We'll change from Paul did this, Barnabas did this, and his followers did this too. He'll pick up a physician and somebody to follow him around and write all this down. And so we have a first-hand account of what Paul actually did. And he will write a gospel too, because he'll hang around with Paul and Peter and Barnabas and everybody else. And so that's what to look forward to starting next week in chapter 20. Pretty cool stuff. Any questions, thoughts? No.
Is, let's see, Herod killed James, the brother of John. Is that same James that writes the book of James?
No.
It's a different one.
Son of Thunder, it was John's brother. It wasn't
Yes.
the one that James was Christ's brother.
Christ, yeah.
Brother of Christ, yeah. Yeah. Obviously, because he cut his head off, it couldn't have been that one. So, any questions? We're all good?
We're all good.
We're all theologians?
Getting there.
All right, we'll pray. We'll be glad when all this goofiness is over with. It'd be nice to see some human beings every once in a while. And which door was that? Oh, it's the AA coming in. We can see some human beings and be kind of out from under the stress of figuring out what do we do next, you know. But anyway, we'll make the best of it, and y'all do too. So, Lord in heaven, we're grateful to you to be gathered here, even amongst all the confusion and craziness. Lord, we live in an age where you give us the ability to spread your word even when we can't see face to face, and that's awesome. Lord, be with us. Help us take these things, everybody who's heard this today, everybody who's here with us today, they ingest your words and use them in their life to get to know you better and to draw closer to you in all things. Lord, continue to guide us in our daily lives. We're grateful for all you provide for us. In the holy name of Jesus, amen.
Amen.
That's that. Are you sure you want to end your stream?